If you had been sitting in that mahogany-paneled law office last Tuesday, watching my mother Linda adjust her pearl necklace and my brother David straighten his banker's tie, you might have thought this was just another routine will reading. But when Mr. Wells cleared his throat and announced that Sarah Mitchell, that's me, would inherit exactly $50 in the form of an old savings bond, the room erupted. My mother's laughter rang out like broken glass. David snorted so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. Even my sister Jennifer, always the diplomat, couldn't hide her smirk behind her manicured fingers. But I didn't flinch. I reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out a manila envelope, and placed it calmly on the polished conference table. The laughter died instantly when I opened it and spread out the documents inside. Property deeds, tax records, financial statements, all bearing one signature that made David's face drain of color, and Linda's pearls suddenly look very, very cheap. "Congratulations on your inheritance," I said, my voice steady as mountain stone. "I thought you might want to know who actually owns the building that keeps this entire town alive." The silence that followed was so thick you could have carved it with a knife, because what they were staring at wasn't just any property deed. It was the ownership papers for Millbrook Shopping Center, all 42 acres of it, every store, every parking space, every dollar of rent that flowed through the veins of our dying little town. That $50 savings bond was supposed to be the punchline to my father's final joke. Instead, it became the setup for mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the youngest Mitchell child in Millbrook, Ohio, I learned early that being different wasn't celebrated in our house. It was tolerated at best. While David played Little League and Jennifer practiced piano for her recitals, I spent my afternoons in the basement with graph paper and colored pencils, sketching floor plans of houses that existed only in my imagination. My mother would find these drawings scattered across my bedroom floor and shake her head with that particular brand of disappointment reserved for children who refuse to fit into neat categories. "Sarah's in her own little world again," she'd tell visitors, as if my creativity were some kind of medical condition that might be contagious. My father Bob was less diplomatic. He'd glance at my architectural dreams and mutter something about pie-in-the-sky nonsense before returning to his newspaper and his beer. The only person who ever looked at my drawings with genuine interest was my grandmother Rose, my father's mother, who lived in the small blue house 3 blocks away on Elm Street. Rose Mitchell had hands like weathered leather and eyes that sparkled with mischief. Every Saturday morning, she'd pick me up in her ancient Buick, and we'd drive around Millbrook while she told me stories about buildings. Not just what they looked like, but what they meant. She'd point to the old brick bank downtown and explain how its solid construction had survived the Depression. She'd show me the Victorian houses on the hill and describe how their wraparound porches were designed for community, for neighbors stopping by to share gossip and lemonade on summer evenings. "Buildings tell stories, honey," she'd say, her voice warm as honey butter. "And the best stories are about people finding their place in the world." Those Saturday mornings with Rose were like oxygen to my soul. She never made me feel strange for caring about cornerstones and crown molding. She never suggested I should be more like David with his baseball trophies, or Jennifer with her perfect grades in subjects that actually mattered. At family dinners, the conversation always seemed to flow around me like water around a stone. David would regale everyone with tales from his summer job at First National Bank, where he was learning the family business of being important and well-respected. Jennifer would share updates about her social activities, her college plans, her boyfriend Trevor, who came from the right kind of family. When the attention occasionally turned to me, it was usually in the form of gentle correction. "Sarah, sit up straight. Sarah, don't play with your food. Sarah, why don't you tell everyone about your grades?" But my grades, while perfectly respectable, weren't the kind that made parents beam with pride. I was more interested in understanding how the school building's heating system worked than memorizing dates for history class. I'd rather sketch the geometric patterns in our kitchen tile than solve algebra problems that seemed to have no connection to the real world. The summer I turned 15, everything shifted in a way that seemed subtle at the time but would prove to be seismic. David graduated high school, and Dad officially brought him into Mitchell's Hardware as a full partner. Suddenly, every family conversation revolved around inventory management, supplier relationships, and 5-year business plans. Jennifer announced her acceptance to Ohio State with a partial scholarship, cementing her status as the family's academic star. And me? I was the one who helped Mom clear the dinner dishes while they discussed futures that apparently didn't include me. It was during this same summer that Rose started teaching me about property values and real estate development. She'd been quietly buying and selling small parcels of land around Millbrook for decades, not for profit but for preservation. She'd purchase an old house scheduled for demolition and find a young family to restore it. She'd buy a vacant lot and turn it into a community garden. Rose understood something that the rest of my family never grasped: that buildings and land weren't just investments or commodities. They were the foundation of everything that made life worth living. "Your father thinks business is about moving inventory," she told me one afternoon as we sat on her front porch, watching the afternoon shadows stretch across her garden. "But real wealth comes from understanding what people actually need, not just what they'll buy." She handed me a thick folder filled with property deeds, survey maps, and financial records. "I want you to have this, Sarah. Not now, but someday when you're ready to understand what it really means." I was too young then to comprehend the weight of what she was offering me. I just knew that someone finally believed I might have something valuable to contribute to the world. Rose died suddenly that October, just 2 weeks after my 16th birthday. Her funeral was standing room only, filled with people whose lives she'd quietly touched through her small acts of community building. But at the reading of her will, I discovered that her faith in me had been more than just encouraging words. Rose had left me something precious: $27,000 in an education trust fund, specifically designated for studying architecture or real estate development. She'd also left me her collection of property surveys and local development plans dating back 50 years, along with a handwritten note that simply said, "For Sarah, who sees the stories that buildings want to tell." My parents' reaction to this unexpected inheritance was complicated. On one hand, they couldn't argue with the practical value of having my college education funded. On the other hand, Rose's gesture seemed to validate my impractical interests in a way that made them uncomfortable. David muttered something about favoritism and how Rose had always been eccentric. Jennifer offered polite congratulations while clearly calculating whether this changed my status in the family hierarchy. Mom and Dad exchanged the kind of loaded glances that spoke volumes about their private conversations. "Well," my father finally said, "I suppose this means you'll be going off to study your building nonsense after all." He didn't mean it to sound supportive, and it didn't, but for the first time in my life, I realized that their approval wasn't actually necessary for my dreams to become reality. Rose had given me something more valuable than money. She'd given me independence. The remaining 2 years of high school passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. My family went through the motions of including me in their plans and conversations, but there was an underlying understanding that I was already halfway out the door. David spent those years learning the hardware business, while the town's economy slowly crumbled around the edges. Big box stores were opening in the county seat, and local businesses like ours were feeling the squeeze. Jennifer thrived at Ohio State, calling home every Sunday with stories about sorority life and internships at marketing firms. Meanwhile, I spent my afternoons at the town library, reading everything I could find about real estate development, urban planning, and small-town economic revitalization. I studied the demographics of Millbrook, learning that our population had been slowly declining for 15 years as young people left for opportunities in larger cities. I researched successful small-town development projects in similar communities across the Midwest. Most importantly, I started to understand the economic ecosystem that kept places like Millbrook alive, or let them wither away. The Millbrook Shopping Center had been built in 1987 on the edge of town, anchored by a grocery store, a pharmacy, and a dozen smaller retail spaces. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the commercial heart that kept blood flowing through our community's veins. People drove from 3 counties away to shop there, bringing money and life into our struggling downtown area. The shopping center provided jobs for nearly 200 people and generated tax revenue that funded our schools, our fire department, and our road maintenance. By my senior year, I had developed what I privately called the plan. I would study architecture and business at the University of Colorado in Denver, far enough away to gain perspective, but close enough to mountain landscapes that reminded me of the hills around Millbrook. I would learn everything I could about commercial real estate development, historic preservation, and small-town economic development. And someday, somehow, I would return to Millbrook with the knowledge and resources to save it from the slow death that was claiming so many places like it. The night before I left for college, I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by boxes and suitcases, looking through Rose's folder of property documents one more time. Hidden in the back, I found something I'd missed before. A hand-drawn map of Millbrook with certain properties circled in red ink. The shopping center was one of them. Written in Rose's careful handwriting along the margin were the words, "The keys to the kingdom are always hidden in plain sight." I tucked that map into my laptop case and carried it with me to Denver, along with Rose's trust fund, her faith in my dreams, and a growing determination to prove that the weird Mitchell kid might just have something valuable to offer the world after all. My departure for Colorado was as understated as everything else about my role in the family. Mom packed me a lunch for the drive and reminded me to call when I arrived safely. Dad shook my hand and told me to work hard and stay out of trouble. David was busy with inventory at the store, and Jennifer was back at Ohio State for her junior year, so neither of them were there to see me load my belongings into Rose's old Buick, which had become mine after her death. As I drove past the Millbrook Shopping Center on my way to the highway, I made myself a promise that seemed impossible at the time but felt as solid as concrete in my chest. Someday I would be back, and when I returned, I would have the power to ensure that this place, these people, this community that had never quite known what to do with me, would never have to worry about survival again. The manila envelope had been sitting in my office safe for 3 months before I finally decided what to do with it. Marcus Chen, my business partner at Rocky Mountain Properties, had watched me retrieve it from the locked drawer at least a dozen times, always staring at the contents with the same expression someone might wear when defusing a bomb. The documents inside represented more than just a real estate transaction. They represented the kind of power that could reshape an entire community, the kind of influence that could make or break the economic future of every family in Millbrook, Ohio. "You're really going to do this?" Marcus asked on that gray Tuesday morning when I finally sealed the envelope and placed it in my briefcase. He was leaning against my office window, coffee mug in hand, looking out at the Denver skyline with the kind of concern that comes from watching a friend walk toward a cliff. "You know there's no taking this back once you put those papers on that table." I adjusted the strap on my briefcase and checked my watch. The flight to Columbus was leaving in 3 hours, and I had a rental car waiting to drive me the final hour to Millbrook. "Some things can't be taken back anyway," I told him. "Sometimes you just have to decide whether you want to be the person who watches from the sidelines or the person who changes the game entirely." Marcus had been there when the call came in 6 weeks earlier. Amy Rodriguez, my old high school friend, had tracked down my business number after seeing an article about Rocky Mountain Properties in some trade magazine. Her voice on the phone had carried that particular mixture of excitement and dread that comes with delivering news that will upend someone's world. "Sarah, I'm sorry to be calling with this, but your dad passed away last week," she'd said, and I remember how my hand had gone completely still on my computer mouse. "Heart attack. It was quick. The funeral was yesterday, and I know you probably didn't hear about it, but there's going to be a will reading next Tuesday at Mr. Z.S. Wells's office downtown." The strange thing was how little I felt in that moment. Not grief, exactly, because grief implies the loss of something you actually had. Not relief either, because that would suggest I'd been carrying some burden of relationship that had finally been lifted. What I felt was more like completion, as if a story that had been suspended mid-sentence for 10 years was finally going to reach its conclusion. I'd been building toward this moment without even realizing it. Every successful project, every strategic acquisition, every careful calculation that had grown Rocky Mountain Properties from a one-woman operation into a $15 million enterprise had somehow been preparing me for a single Tuesday afternoon in a small-town lawyer's office. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family who had spent my entire childhood treating my business interests as some kind of elaborate fantasy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Was about to discover exactly how real those fantasies had become. The acquisition of Millbrook Shopping Center had happened almost by accident 18 months earlier. I'd been researching small-town commercial properties across the Midwest, looking for undervalued assets in communities with stable populations and limited competition. Millbrook fit the profile perfectly. A town of 8,000 people with no major retail alternatives within 30 miles. Anchored by a shopping center that generated consistent revenue despite minimal investment in maintenance or modernization. When the ownership group had put the property on the market, citing their desire to focus on larger urban developments, I'd submitted an offer through a subsidiary corporation called Buckeye Commercial Holdings. The name was deliberately generic, designed to avoid attracting attention or speculation about the buyer's identity. To the sellers, I was just another faceless investment company looking to add a reliable income property to their portfolio. To the tenants, I was an anonymous landlord who paid for necessary repairs promptly and never raised rent beyond reasonable cost of living adjustments. But to me, Millbrook Shopping Center represented something much more significant than a real estate investment. It was the economic heartbeat of my hometown, the commercial hub that determined whether local families could find jobs, whether the school district could fund extracurricular programs, whether elderly residents could access prescription medications without driving an hour to the county seat. Owning it meant holding the future of the entire community in my hands. The purchase had required $8.2 million, nearly 60% of my available liquid assets at the time. Marcus had argued against it, pointing out that we could buy 3 similar properties in faster-growing markets for the same price. He wasn't wrong from a purely financial perspective, but he was missing the emotional equation that made this particular deal impossible to pass up. I wasn't just buying a shopping center. I was buying the power to ensure that the place that had never had room for me would never have to worry about survival again. For 18 months, I'd managed the property quietly from Denver, working through a local management company that handled day-to-day operations. The tenants knew their rent checks were processed by Buckeye Commercial Holdings, but they had no idea that the company was owned entirely by the weird Mitchell kid who used to draw house plans in her basement bedroom. The anonymity had been intentional. I wanted to understand how the property functioned, how the local economy depended on it, how my family and the rest of Millbrook related to this commercial anchor that kept their world spinning. What I discovered during those months of quiet observation was both better and worse than I'd expected. The shopping center was more profitable than the previous owners had realized, generating nearly $600,000 in annual revenue after expenses. The businesses were thriving despite minimal marketing or promotional support. The grocery store was expanding its organic produce section. The pharmacy had added a small clinic. Even the struggling bookstore in the corner unit had found new life by hosting community events and book clubs. But I also learned that the property's success was built on a foundation that was more fragile than anyone realized. 3 of the anchor tenants were operating on lease agreements that would expire within the next 2 years. The parking lot needed resurfacing. The HVAC systems were 15 years past their recommended replacement dates. The previous owners had deferred maintenance for nearly a decade, milking profits without reinvesting in the property's long-term viability. Most troubling of all, I discovered that Mitchell's Hardware, my family's store, had been struggling far more than anyone had publicly acknowledged. David had been behind on rent for 8 months, surviving only because the previous ownership group had been too distracted by other investments to pursue collections aggressively. The store that had been the pride of 3 generations of Mitchell men was barely hanging on, kept alive by the kind of willful ignorance that mistakes hope for a business plan. Learning about my family's financial situation through tenant reports and rent rolls felt like reading someone else's diary. David had applied for loan modifications 3 times in the past year. He'd requested permission to sublease half of his retail space to a cell phone repair shop. He'd even approached the management company about converting the hardware store into some kind of mixed-use space that could generate additional income through apartment rentals above the retail floor. Meanwhile, according to Amy Rodriguez's periodic updates, the family had been presenting a very different picture to the Millbrook community. David was serving on the Chamber of Commerce board, promoting himself as a successful local business leader. Linda had joined the Historical Society and spent her time organizing fundraisers for downtown beautification projects. Jennifer visited from Columbus every few months, bringing her husband and 2 children for family gatherings that were carefully documented on social media to project an image of prosperity and togetherness. The disconnection between their public image and private reality would have been amusing if it weren't so predictable. This was the same family that had spent my childhood emphasizing appearances over substance, social status over genuine achievement, the perception of success over the hard work required to actually build something lasting. They'd been so focused on looking like the kind of people who belonged in their community that they'd forgotten to pay attention to whether their community could actually survive. As I prepared to return to Millbrook for the will reading, I found myself thinking about Rose and the lessons she'd tried to teach me during those Saturday morning drives. She'd understood something fundamental about wealth and power that my parents had never grasped. That real security comes not from what you can take from a community, but from what you can contribute to it. The shopping center wasn't just my investment property. It was my insurance policy. My guarantee that no matter what happened with family relationships or personal recognition, I would always have the power to protect the place that had shaped me. The documents in my briefcase represented the culmination of 10 years of strategic planning and careful preparation. Property deeds showing my ownership of Millbrook Shopping Center, financial statements demonstrating the property's profitability and my management of it, lease agreements that would expire over the next 24 months, giving me the power to determine which businesses would continue operating and which would need to find new locations. And most importantly, a detailed development plan I'd been working on for months, outlining how the property could be expanded and modernized to serve the community for the next 50 years. I had no illusions about what would happen when I placed those documents on Mr. Wells' conference table. The revelation would shatter my family's understanding of who I was and what I'd become. It would force them to reconcile their image of me as the impractical dreamer who'd wandered off to Colorado with the reality of me as the person who now controlled their economic future. It would transform every conversation we'd ever had about success and failure, about belonging and worth, about who mattered and who didn't in the complicated ecosystem of family and community. But more than that, it would give me something I'd been chasing my entire life without fully understanding what I was looking for: the power to rewrite the ending of my own story. Not through revenge or vindication, but through the kind of quiet, devastating demonstration that some people spend decades working toward without ever achieving. The flight to Columbus was turbulent, and I spent most of it staring out the window at the patchwork of farmland and small towns that stretched across the American heartland. Somewhere down there was Millbrook, looking exactly the same as it had when I'd left for college, probably struggling with the same economic challenges that had been building for decades. In a few hours, I would be sitting in a conference room with people who had known me my entire life but had never really seen me at all. The rental car was waiting as promised, and I drove the familiar route from Columbus to Millbrook with the kind of muscle memory that comes from traveling the same roads for 18 years. The landscape hadn't changed much. The same grain silos marked the horizon. The same billboards advertised the same regional businesses. The same rest stops offered the same fast food and gas station coffee that had sustained countless trips between my old life and my new one. But as I turned off the highway at the Millbrook exit and drove past the shopping center that I now owned, I realized that everything else was about to change in ways that none of us could have imagined. The building looked exactly as I remembered it, solid and unremarkable and absolutely essential to the community that surrounded it. In a few hours, my family would learn that the weird kid with the building obsession had grown up to become the person who held their entire world in her hands. The manila envelope sat on the passenger seat beside me, thick with documents that represented years of careful planning and strategic thinking. Inside were the keys to the kingdom that Rose had told me to look for, hidden in plain sight, just like she'd promised. I'd found them not through inheritance or luck, but through the kind of patient, methodical work that builds empires one decision at a time. As I drove toward downtown Millbrook, and the law office where my family was waiting to divide up my father's modest estate, I couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all. They were about to learn that the $50 savings bond they'd found so amusing was nothing compared to the $8.2 million surprise I was about to deliver. The daughter they'd forgotten to take seriously had grown up to become the person they couldn't afford to ignore. The game was about to change, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding all the cards. The smell of sawdust and WD-40 was the first thing that hit you when you walked into Mitchell's Hardware on Main Street. It was a scent that had defined my childhood in ways I didn't fully understand until I was old enough to realize that not every little girl spent her afternoons organizing nuts and bolts by size while her father worked the register. The store had been in our family since 1962, when my grandfather, Frank Mitchell, had bought the narrow two-story building and filled it with everything a growing town might need to fix, build, or improve the world around them. Those were the golden years, when Millbrook was still expanding and young families were moving into new subdivisions that needed sprinkler systems and screen doors, and the kind of small repairs that kept houses feeling like homes. My father Bob had grown up in that store, learning the business from the ground up, and when he inherited it in 1985, Mitchell's Hardware was still the beating heart of our downtown commercial district. People came not just for supplies, but for advice, for community news, for the kind of human connection that made small-town life feel warm and sustainable. I was probably 4 years old when I first remember spending entire afternoons in the store, sitting cross-legged on the linoleum floor while my father taught me the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. He was different there. More patient than he ever was at home, more willing to explain things in the careful detail that comes from genuine expertise. Tools are like words, Sarah, he'd tell me, holding up a socket wrench set. You need the right one for the job, and once you know how to use them properly, you can fix almost anything. The store had a rhythm that became as familiar to me as breathing. Morning coffee with the contractors who came in for supplies before heading to their job sites. Lunchtime visits from homeowners tackling weekend projects. After-school crowds of teenagers buying bike chains and skateboard wheels. Saturday mornings when families would arrive together. Parents consulting with my father about bathroom renovations while kids like me wandered the aisles, fascinated by the endless possibilities contained in bins of screws and displays of power tools. My mother, Linda, worked part-time at the elementary school, but she'd often stop by the store in the afternoons, bringing homemade cookies for the regular customers, and helping with the bookkeeping that kept the business running smoothly. During those years, our family felt like a unit, each of us playing a role in something bigger than ourselves. David was the heir apparent, even at age 8, already showing the kind of natural charisma that made customers smile and ask about his baseball games. Jennifer was the social butterfly, charming everyone who walked through the door with her precocious questions and infectious laughter. And me? I was the one who noticed things. While David learned to work the cash register and Jennifer practiced her people skills, I was drawn to the architectural bones of the store itself. I'd spent hours studying the way the original tin ceiling had been designed to maximize natural light from the tall windows facing Main Street. I'd traced the patterns in the hardwood floors that my grandfather had installed himself, noting how the planks had been arranged to guide foot traffic toward the most profitable displays. I'd climb the narrow stairs to the stockroom and imagine how the space could be reconfigured to be more efficient, more welcoming, more connected to the community it served. My father noticed my interest in the building's structure and began teaching me about the practical side of construction and repair. He'd show me how to read the blueprints that contractors brought in, explaining the symbols and measurements that translated someone's vision into concrete reality. He'd let me help with inventory in the stockroom, teaching me to see patterns in what people bought and when, helping me understand that successful retail was really about predicting what your community would need before they knew they needed it. Business isn't just about selling things, he told me one afternoon when I was 7, as we unpacked a shipment of garden supplies in preparation for spring. It's about being part of people's lives, helping them solve problems, and build the kind of world they want to live in. When Mrs. Peterson comes in here looking for the right fertilizer for her roses, she's not just buying plant food. She's buying the promise that her garden will be beautiful, that her neighborhood will be a place where people take pride in their homes. Those lessons felt like treasure to me, more valuable than any allowance or birthday gift. I started keeping a notebook where I'd write down everything I learned about business, about construction, about the way buildings and communities work together to create something larger than the sum of their parts. I'd draw diagrams of the store's layout and brainstorm ways to improve the customer experience. I'd study the seasonal patterns of sales and make suggestions about when to order certain items and how to display them for maximum impact. My father seemed genuinely proud of my interest in the business during those early years. He'd bring customers over to meet me, introducing me as my little business partner, and explaining how I'd helped reorganize the paint section or suggested a new way to display the seasonal merchandise. I'd beam with pride when he'd tell people that I had a natural eye for retail, and that I understood customers in ways that couldn't be taught from a textbook. The store was also where I first learned to understand the broader economic ecosystem of our town. I'd listen to conversations between my father and other business owners, learning about the challenges of competing with big box stores that were opening in the county seat. I'd hear discussions about property taxes and zoning regulations and the kind of municipal decisions that could make or break a small business. I'd watch as longtime customers gradually shifted their purchasing patterns, buying major appliances at the chain stores while still relying on Mitchell's Hardware for specialized items and expert advice. Even as a child, I could sense the underlying tension in these conversations. The retail landscape was changing in ways that threatened the traditional model of downtown commerce that had sustained places like Millbrook for generations. The customers who had once bought everything from lawn mowers to Christmas lights at our store were now driving 20 minutes to save $10 on items they could find at the big box retailers. My father and his peers were working harder than ever while watching their profit margins shrink and their customer base slowly erode. But during those golden years of my childhood, these challenges felt manageable, like problems that could be solved through hard work and adaptation. The store was still profitable, still busy, still central to the life of our community. My father was still respected as a local business leader, still confident in his ability to navigate whatever changes the future might bring. Our family was still united around the shared project of maintaining something that had been built by previous generations and would hopefully be passed down to future ones. The annual Chamber of Commerce dinners were like family reunions in those days, bringing together all the business owners and civic leaders who formed the backbone of Millbrook's economy. My parents would dress up in their best clothes and drive to the country club, where they'd spend the evening socializing with the people who made our town function. My father would give speeches about the importance of supporting local businesses. My mother would organize fundraisers for the school district and the volunteer fire department. They were pillars of the community, the kind of people whose opinions mattered and whose involvement made a difference. I remember feeling so proud of them during those events, watching from the kids' table as my parents moved through the crowd, with the easy confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were. My father's handshake was firm and genuine. My mother's smile was warm and inclusive. They were respected not just for their business success, but for their commitment to the community that had given them opportunities to build something meaningful. The store itself was a reflection of that community commitment. My father extended credit to customers who were going through temporary financial difficulties. He'd order special items for people who needed something specific, even if it meant tying up capital and inventory that might sit on the shelf for months. He'd donate supplies for school projects and community events, understanding that his business was only as strong as the town that supported it. During the summer months, when school was out and the weather was perfect for outdoor projects, the store would buzz with activity from morning until closing time. Contractors would arrive early to load up their trucks with supplies for the day's work. Homeowners would stop by during lunch breaks to pick up materials for evening and weekend projects. Families would bring their children in to choose paint colors for bedrooms, or to select the perfect hinges for a backyard fort. I loved those busy summer days, when the store felt like the center of the universe and everyone who walked through the door was working on something that would make their world a little bit better. I'd help customers find what they needed, explaining the differences between various types of screws, or recommending the best tools for specific jobs. I'd watch my father work with contractors, discussing the technical details of complex projects with the kind of expertise that came from decades of hands-on experience. It was during one of those perfect summer afternoons when I was 9 years old that I first realized I wanted to spend my life working with buildings and construction. A local contractor named Jim Walsh had brought in blueprints for a new house he was building on the outskirts of town, and he'd spread them out on the counter while discussing his supply needs with my father. I'd been fascinated by the detailed drawings, the precise measurements, the way lines on paper could represent someone's dream of the perfect home. "What do you think, Sarah?" Jim had asked, noticing my intense focus on the blueprints. "Think this house will be a good place to raise a family?" I'd studied the plans carefully, tracing the flow from room to room, imagining how the space would feel when it was filled with furniture and family life. The kitchen is in the wrong place, I'd said finally. If you put it here instead, I'd pointed to a different location. The morning sun would come through the windows while people are having breakfast, and the mother could watch her children play in the backyard while she's cooking dinner. Jim had looked at me with surprise, then studied the blueprints again, with the kind of attention that suggested he was taking my suggestion seriously. You know what? He'd said to my father. She's absolutely right. That kitchen placement would work much better for a young family. My father had beamed with pride, and I'd felt a surge of confidence that would influence every decision I made for the rest of my life. I had discovered something I was naturally good at, something that connected my love of buildings with my understanding of how people wanted to live their lives. I'd found my calling, and it had happened in the place where I felt most comfortable and most valued. Those golden afternoons at Mitchell's Hardware were the foundation of everything I would later build. They taught me that business success came from understanding what people actually needed, not just what they said they wanted. They showed me that buildings were more than just structures. They were the framework within which communities and families created their most important memories. They gave me the confidence to believe that my ideas mattered, that my perspective had value, that I could contribute something meaningful to the world around me. But perhaps most importantly, they gave me a vision of what family could be when it was built around shared purpose and mutual respect. During those years, I felt like an essential part of something larger than myself, valued for my unique contributions and supported in my growing understanding of the world. My father's pride in my insights felt genuine and unconditional. My mother's encouragement of my interests felt warm and sustaining. Even David and Jennifer seemed to appreciate having a little sister who could help customers find what they needed and who understood the business that supported our family's way of life. Of course, I was too young then to understand how fragile that golden time really was, how dependent it was on economic conditions and family dynamics that were already beginning to shift in ways that would change everything. I couldn't have predicted that the big box stores would eventually hollow out our downtown district, or that my father's confidence in his ability to adapt would prove insufficient for the challenges ahead. I couldn't have imagined that my siblings would grow up to see the hardware store as a burden rather than a blessing, or that my parents would eventually come to view my architectural interests as impractical dreaming rather than valuable preparation for the future. All I knew then was that I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by people who valued what I had to offer, and supported by a business that served something larger than profit. The smell of sawdust and WD-40 meant home to me, and home meant a place where I was seen, appreciated, and loved for exactly who I was becoming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.